In this specific failure case, it's worth rewinding back to February. Back in February, there was this entire ecosystem headed up by this guy, Daniele Sesta, who's an Ethereum developer. Not Ethereum core developer, but a developer on the Ethereum ecosystem and others, who created a lending protocol called Abracadabra. Now, off the bat, it's called Abracadabra, and their stable currency was called Magic Internet Money. So I'll leave you and the listeners to make whatever assumptions about that as you will. But it was a very legitimate protocol in terms of the mechanism. And without getting too deep in the weeds, it was a lending protocol. It allowed you to commit collateral and then mint a stable coin. And so that's not very different if you're familiar with MakerDAO, where you get to put down volatile underlying and then mint a stable loan against it. And if the underlying goes below a certain level, then your position gets liquidated and your collateral gets taken. So kind of standard lending protocol. Mm-hmm. But what Abracadabra allowed you to do was recursively borrow MIM, swap it for UST, stake it in Anchor Protocol, turn it into a staking token called AUST, and then put it back into Abracadabra as collateral, and then mint more MIM and repeat the cycle.
Okay.
Now, the most important takeaway of this like recursive lending thing is that it allows you to access extremely high leverage. Mm. And so you run the recursive loop a couple times, and your 20% APR in Anchor, as long as you can borrow money at less than 20%, becomes much bigger than 20. And so in this degen box strategy, people were able to yield, 100% APRs. The problem is there's a lot of leverage in that system now.
Yep.
And that increases the sensitivity of your lending position to the underlying collateral. And because the collateral was UST denominated, people were lulled into a false sense of security. They were like, the underlying collateral is stable collateral. So as long as UST holds peg, we're good. Now, the problem is, in that case, UST didn't hold peg because there was a bit of a panic and people sold a bunch of UST and it pushed the price of UST down and it started liquidating lending positions.
How much did it lose its peg by at that time?
That time, I believe it lost its peg by like 8%. So it got down to like 92 cents.
Okay.
I'll have to double check my facts on that, but I believe it got down to 92.
Not good, but not catastrophic.
Not catastrophic unless you have something like a 92% levered UST position that's really sensitive to the price of the underlying. Now, the problem with these recursive lending things is once collateral starts getting liquidated, the collateral, I'll remind you in this case, is UST denominated. So more UST gets dumped on the open market and drops the price of UST further, which then liquidates more. And that creates this liquidation cascade.
Like a contagion effect.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, because of the way Luna UST works, when UST is below peg, you can always get $1 worth of Luna for it. So if UST is at 92 cents, you can always redeem this thing that's only worth 92 cents and get something that's worth $1 of Luna.
Hold on. So there's another cycle you can perform there to arbitrage.
So there's always that redemption mechanism between UST and Luna. You can always redeem 1 UST, regardless of what its market value is, for $1 of Luna.
But could you then buy $100 of UST at an 8% discount, redeem that for $100 of Luna, sell Luna on the open market?
Yes, that's exactly what they're hoping you will do. And the reason why that's part of the peg stability mechanism is because you purchasing UST on the open market increases the demand, and it should bring it back up to $1.
Right. Okay, I see.
So that should close
the arb. The arb itself closes itself.
It should close itself. Now, the hard part about it closing itself is, let's talk about the second part, right? You buy a bunch of UST, which supports the UST price, and you redeem it for Luna, but then what do you do with that Luna? You dump it immediately because you want to make sure you get your 8-cent ARB. Mm-hmm. You don't want to hold Luna while it's falling. But the more people do that, the lower the price of Luna goes.
Right.
And the lower the price of Luna, the more Luna has to be created in order to support UST redemptions.
Which creates the inflation.
And that creates this runaway, what people call the death spiral effect, which is what we saw a couple Mondays ago and sent Luna essentially to zero. I think it's hovering around like 13 millionths of a cent or something like that. There's many zeros in front of the first significant figure in its value. So yeah, that is the death cycle. So this happened in February and it sent Luna prices crashing down. And I think the Luna Foundation Guard, now it's important to introduce this other entity. The Luna Foundation Guard is essentially the central treasury entity of the Luna network. And so this is Do Kwon and a bunch of network insiders who have Luna in the treasury for creating the protocol. The Luna Foundation Guard,
Pre-mine.
like a pre-mine,
But
right?
do they own it, or does the treasury own it? Is it like an entity that owns it, or do they individually own it?
It's an entity that has a number of. It's essentially a board that governs this gigantic pot of Luna.
But do they hold it for the benefit of Luna?
Yes.
Right,
So they
okay.
hold it for the benefit of the Luna network.
Okay.
But they ultimately had discretion over the way the funds were spent.
Do we know how many people are on this board?
At the time, I believe it was about seven folks, but really, it was gathered at Do Kwon's discretion,
Okay.
right? It was really under Do Kwon's control. And so you've got this central entity, and they saw what happened to Luna price because of this death spiral effect in Abracadabra in February. And they said, man, it's not so great that UST gets redeemed for Luna and it can initiate a death spiral at any time. Anyone can really, a large UST sell event or a recursive leverage unwinding can really just depeg UST and then send Luna crashing down. And once the train leaves the station, it's really hard to stop. The momentum of this death spiral is buy UST, redeem it for Luna, dump Luna. Luna's price starts crashing down, and every incremental UST that gets redeemed sends Luna price even further down. So it's really scary. And recall that you need Luna price to be high for a lot of different reasons. But one of the reasons you really need it to be high is because you need to sell it to fund the Anchor Protocol reserve.
Do you need it to be high, or you need it to be growing in value?
You need it to be high and growing in value. So the directionality is also really important. In an ideal world, it kind of increases in value slowly over time, and the system strengthens step by step. Now, what you don't necessarily want is what happened, over the course of the last few months, where the Luna price spiked super, super high. A bunch of UST was redeemed, or Luna was burned for UST at a very high value. The supply of UST grows. And then what is UST? UST is essentially a claim on Luna. So you've printed a bunch of claims on Luna while Luna's at a very high price. Then when Luna starts coming down, you have all these outstanding claims, but not enough Luna to pay it back.
Okay.
So very complex.
Yeah.
Lots of complexity. But let's talk about Bitcoin.
But I mean that's an issue in itself. Because like I say, interestingly, I've never used the stablecoin, funny enough. Never used one, never had a need for one. I use the pound and I buy Bitcoin. But I fully understand why people would, like say, use a stablecoin in certain jurisdictions. And if somebody asked me, I would say, yeah, you should use them. If they ask me which one, well, I mean, I know about Tether. DAI seems to, up until recently, remain fairly stable. UST was growing in popularity. I didn't know anything about it, but now I'm scared to recommend anything without knowing everything about it. But I don't have the time to learn this, and it's not even just a case of learning. It's very complex, and there's unknown unknowns.
It is incredibly complex. I think this is where I'll maybe say something unpopular that I've been beating the drum on. The industry needs the industry needs disclosure. The industry needs norms of disclosure. We need to all look around the table and say, we need to disclose risks to investors, in a really upfront way.
I mean, that's what the SEC prefers people to do. And I know it's not popular certainly in Bitcoin and crypto world to have centralized entities providing any form of protection. But that's the role of the SEC, is to protect people in scenarios like this.
Now, why do we hate the SEC? I think that's worth talking about, right?
Yeah.
Well, John, if disclosure, why not SEC? The SEC enforces disclosure. Why not give it to them? Because I think there's a very reasonable pushback that the SEC doesn't know what they're talking about.
I think that's very reasonable.
And they're not educated. And they could require disclosures that are immaterial or onerous. And that's why I'm a proponent for proactive disclosure.
Self-regulation.
Yeah, and I'm not saying that's the silver bullet. I'm not saying, hey, we're going to get to a place where nobody gets rugged, but everyone should be able to at least see something like a 10K when they explore a protocol, right?
What's a 10K?
A 10K is the SEC's mandated public annual disclosure, shareholder disclosure for publicly listed equities.
Well, one of the big fears that Bitcoiners have is an exchange doing what happened with Mt. Gox again.
Sure.
People losing their Bitcoin.
Sure.
And Kraken has a proof of reserve. I'm pretty sure they did the whole proof of reserves, and you can check their reserve status.
Sure.
That's I guess their version of a 10K in some ways.
Yeah, it's something like that, right? But there's more to a 10K. There's discussion of risks. There are public financials, like the financial health of the organization. There's what's called MD&A, which is management discussion and analysis, which is, hey, here are the insiders' takes on how the business is doing and where it's going. And it's all
MDMA.
something like that. It's just a way to create a norm of transparency.
Yeah.
And everyone, of course, is bound by this legally, centrally legally structured incentive where everyone has to be a fiduciary, right? The management has to be a fiduciary to shareholders, which means that they have a legal obligation, and in fact, a criminally enforced legal obligation to disclose things. Now, I'm not calling for that, but I don't think it's beyond the pale to say, hey, legitimate protocols should be really upfront about the failure case. And people should not have to spend many, many hours on a weekend figuring out what the tail risk is of putting $1 in a savings account.
And to be honest, in fairness, some of them wouldn't be able to figure it out. These things are complicated. I mean, I've had you sat here opposite me, explain it on a one-on-one, and there's still bits I'm going, I still don't understand that. What the fuck are you on about? So, like, it's a lot for people to expect. And I guess also these risks change. Like, was this a known risk prior to Abracadabra? Or is it after Abracadabra? It's like, oh shit, we have this new risk that we weren't aware of.
That introduced a new risk. Yeah. And that's the thing about permissionless markets, right? Is human creativity is unbounded, and where there's money, people are going to want more of it. So the Abracadabra event was kind of an unforeseen event. And then what happened with the Bitcoin treasury was an unforeseen event. And so, yeah, it's impossible. It's almost impossible to know because we're on the frontier of financial innovation here. But that's why it's, in my opinion, it's ever more important to disclose the risks. And people shouldn't see a stablecoin as being as trusted as the US dollar. That being said, I don't necessarily think the US dollar is a great comparison for these monetary experiments. Because let's think about the US dollar. The US dollar was on the gold standard for hundreds of years before it was lifted in the early 20th century. It's a really long time for a thing to make its way into culture and adoption. Imagine for generations, people have been using a currency. Your mother and your mother's mother and your mother's mother's mother all used US dollars, right? There are many other monetary experiments that have failed. Zimbabwe and the Weimar Republic and Venezuela. So I'm not saying that, we shouldn't be really careful here and deliberate about how we experiment with finance. But there are many other failed monetary experiments in human history. DeFi is not the first domain for trying to figure out how to create currency and money.